Okay, brilliant. Okay, hello everybody who's here with us in the chat, and hello to everybody who might be watching this as a recording. My name's Angie. I'm a senior educational psychologist for Southampton City Council, and I'm here today to talk to you about the autism assessment process, including feelings around diagnosis, and also lots of things to do with the autism process. So, prior to being an educational psychologist, I was a specialist for autism. I have previously been involved in completing autism assessments, and as an EP, I have supported families kind of pre and post diagnosis over the past 15 years. I kind of just as a little caveat for the people who are in the meeting today, I'm not currently involved in the assessment process in Southampton. So if you do have any specific questions, I might not be able to answer them, but I'm going to kind of give you as much information as I can about the assessment process and lots of issues around diagnosis as well. I think Lucy's kindly said that if people have got questions, that she's going to pop them in the chat. And yeah, just let me know. And I am notoriously bad at timings, but we think we've got an hour today, and I'll keep a track on time and hopefully get through everything that I'm hoping to. In terms of agenda, I'm going to talk to you a little bit, first of all, about the assessment process to hopefully make you understand it a little bit better. I know that the assessment process can be really anxiety-provoking time for families, so we might think a little bit about how you can prepare for that process. And then we'll speak a little bit about responses to diagnosis, about the feelings that can be experienced by both parents and children, and how we can cope with these feelings. Finally, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we can support your children to kind of understand their diagnosis a little bit better. So, to begin with, starting things off, the diagnostic process. So I've written on the presentation here, so no physical correlate. So basically that means autism is a medical diagnosis. It's really important to remember that you can't tell that a child has autism by looking. You can't take a blood test. There currently isn't a brain scan to tell us. We know that the brains of individuals with autism are wired differently, but our knowledge of neuroimaging isn't enough to kind of even look at brains and say, oh, that's an autistic brain, or that's not. We just can't tell by looking. So the diagnosis is made by looking at observable behaviours. The exact nature of the assessment can vary depending upon the age of the child, their needs, where you are in the country, but there are some key elements that you'll find within the assessment process. People completing the assessment should adhere to what we call NICE guidelines. That's the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And one of the things that it suggests is that it should be a multidisciplinary assessment. So what that means is it's not one person's opinion, that there are a range of professionals that might be involved in that assessment process. That could be paediatricians, it could be clinical psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, even educational psychologists, but it should be a team of professionals who kind of make that decision. The job of that multi-professional team is to decide if the individual reaches the criteria for assessment. And the criteria, what we mean by criteria is it's set down a set of behaviours and needs that the individual should show, and these are written down in manuals. So we have these two manuals that are typically used in diagnosis. These are the ICD-11 and the DSM-5. So the ICD-11 stands for the International Classification of Diseases, version 11, and the DSM-5 stands for the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental, I can't remember now, mental disorders, I think. The ICD-11 is more commonly used in Europe, whereas the DSM-5 is an American version. What we find is, but both manuals have kind of been revised within, I'd say, the past 5 to 10 years. The DSM-5, the ICD-11 more recently. So actually we find that clinicians are kind of still often using the DSM-5 in this country as well, while they're getting to grips with the new ICD-11. However, they are both very similar. The diagnosis shouldn't differ depending on whether your clinician is using the criteria in the ICD-11 or whether they're using the criteria from the DSM-5. So the ICD-11, I've written it on this slide for you. So a child has autism if they have persistent deficits in the ability to initiate and sustain reciprocal social interaction and social communication, and by a range of restricted, repetitive and inflexible patterns of behaviour, interests or activities that are clearly atypical or excessive for the individual's age and socio-cultural context. Goes on to say that the inset of the disorder occurs during the developmental period, typically in early childhood, but symptoms may not become fully manifest until later, when social demands exceed limited capacities. Deficits are sufficiently severe to cause impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, other important areas of functioning, and are usually a pervasive feature of the individual's functioning, observable in all settings, although they may vary according to social, educational, or other context. Individuals along the spectrum exhibit a full range of intellectual functioning and language abilities. Okay, so that's the ICD-11. I know this is very, very complicated wording, so bear with me while I try and break it down for you. I think the DSM-5 kind of breaks it down into criteria. So there are 5 sets of criteria within the DSM-5 that the individual must reach in order to receive a diagnosis of autism. So the first, as we just saw in the ICD-11, is about persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. The second is restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities. It says that these must be present in the early developmental period, clinically significant impairment in functioning, and not better explained by intellectual disability. So again, in English, as I was going to say, I was going to break this down for you. Basically, what this means is that autism is present when your child experiences, or when an adult experiences, differences in social interaction, that is interacting with their peers, social communication, the way that they communicate with others, but socially, and if they are showing restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviour. The criteria also suggests that these differences must have been present in early childhood, so kind of before the age of 3, that they must cause the individual significant difficulties. So they must be impacting upon the individual's day-to-day life in some way, and that these needs can't be better explained by another diagnosis. Okay, I can't see people's faces, but I'm hoping that that is making a little bit of sense to you, because the wording around the diagnostic criteria is quite complicated. If you are interested, you can research the diagnostic criteria online. So this is kind of the basic definition, but there are kind of lots of statements that the clinician will look at to see if the child reaches that criteria when they're making the assessment. And if you're interested, they are available online. If you research those, you are able to kind of look at all the different statements that the child must be able to fulfill in order to receive that diagnosis. So how do clinicians determine whether the child reaches these criteria? First of all, it's important that they consider that child in multiple contexts. You remember me saying that this isn't one person's opinion. It's not just about how that child appears on one day when they come into a clinic. Professionals will be kind of seeking information from schools and from yourselves about how the child typically functions. Again, they'll really be wanting to know about the developmental context. So they'll want to know about what that child's developmental history was like, to determine if the differences that the child is showing were apparent before that child turns about 3 years of age. And there are a number of tools that clinicians can use in order to make this diagnosis. And again, these tools are recommended by that NICE guidance that I suggested earlier. And they're things that you may have heard of before. 2 that I'm going to talk about a little bit about are the ADOS, so that stands for the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, and the ADI-R, that's the Autistic Diagnostic Interview, and the R stands for revised. So that means it's a kind of, there was a version and this is a newer version. So the ADI-R is kind of very important for you as parents, because it may be something that you're involved in. it's exactly what it says. It's an interview. It's a long interview where the clinician will try and get information from you about your child to determine if they have those needs as presented by the criteria and what they were like in their early development as well. The interview is then scored. It's standardized, so your responses to those questions will be scored to determine if the child's needs reach a certain cutoff to suggest whether they have autism or not. The ADOS is, as I said, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. So again, this is with your child, not with the parents. So the child will meet clinicians, like one, usually two, I'd say. And what they do is they put the child, they call them social presses, and that's a difficult word, but what it really means is they kind of put them in different kind of scenarios. So it might be play, so they might be doing a little bit of play with your child. And again, the ADOS will very much determine upon the child's age and nature of difficulty. There are different modules that you can use. For a younger child, it's a lot more about play and looking how they respond in that play scenario. For older children, it's more about talking to your child about things like friendships and then seeing how they communicate. Again, what the clinician does within that ADOS is looks at the child's responses, and then they get scored and then see if those scores reach above a certain cutoff to show whether they meet that criteria. It's important to say when I'm saying that these things are standardized and scored, the diagnosis is very much about the clinician's interpretation as well. So it may be that if a child is reaching a cutoff on these things, but there is evidence to suggest that they don't have a diagnosis, you're not just going to go off those standardized scores. The clinician's going to use all the information they have available to them to determine whether the child reaches that criteria for autism. And again, I think what's important to say about the ADOS is it's not about how there are sort of play tasks, there are some puzzles, but it's not about how the child performs on those things. It's about the child's responses, their social responses within that context, if that makes sense. The exact process is going to determine the exact process of assessment. It's very difficult to tell you exactly what an assessment is going to look like because that is going to differ depending upon your child's age and your child's needs. So here in Southampton, typically if a child is under 5, they'll be seen by a community paediatrician. The paediatrician will see the child in clinic and they will also gather information from other professionals as well. If the child is in a preschool setting, they will be given a social communication questionnaire, which they'll complete so the paediatrician can see what the child looks like in that setting. The paediatrician will be gathering information from a speech and language therapist as well, who would typically be involved if a child is of that age and experiencing these types of needs. Then the paediatrician, rather than going through the ADOS and the ADI, the paediatrician will determine whether that child reaches the criteria for autism. And then if they believe it will, then they will send a big long report and that will go to an autism panel, which again is a team of multi-professionals who will decide if that diagnosis can be endorsed. So that's basically saying that based on all the information that the paediatrician has gathered, they agree that that child reaches the criteria for autism. Okay, I hope that makes sense. It's very difficult without people nodding, but I hope that makes sense. If your child is...
Sorry, Angie.
Yeah.
Can I just ask as well, as I think a lot of concerns parents have around the observation is whether their child might mask some of their sort of
Some of
autistic
their needs.
traits.
Yeah, okay, so that's quite interesting. So what I can talk about personal opinion of masking as well. So what you have to remember is that clinicians are very experienced in using these things. And again, I'd go back to the point I said that although these tools are standardized, the clinician is using kind of all their experience and all the knowledge that they're gathering about this child as well. So if the child has the ADOS, then maybe the ADI as well. And it may be that the parent has kind of talked about what the child is at home in other contexts, because it's about how the child is in different contexts. Also with the ADOS, I think in terms of masking, I remember doing an assessment with a young girl, and I remember sitting there and thinking, well, this child's not autistic, you know, like almost to the point of what am I even doing here? But then actually, some of the questions in the ADOS are actually about that child and how they feel about themselves. And when that child opened up and talked about how they felt difficult, how they felt, that mask kind of fell as well. And actually, in doing that and giving the child the opportunity to talk about their experience, that's often when you don't get so much of that masking anymore. And you have to remember that clinicians are very experienced in doing this and are knowledgeable about masking. So there is a difficulty, and I think part of the difficulty that people recognise is that some of these tools were not, have not, there's an issue about girls in particular and some of these tools in terms of the fact that autism in girls may not be as recognised as it is in boys because it presents differently. You have more masking present in girls. That's not to say young boys don't mask as well, that's apparent as well. But all I can encourage you is that clinicians are experienced with this and will work hard within that ADOS to try and get an accurate picture of what that child might be like. Does that answer your question, Lucy?
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so back to where I was. So I was talking about, yes, so children between the age of 5 and 18 will usually be referred to the Autism Assessment Service. Referrals are made from schools, GPs, other professional social workers can refer into that service as well. All referrals kind of get triaged. There needs to be information from other settings as well to determine whether a diagnosis should go ahead. And then it may be that they are seen by a multi-professional team with tools such as the ADOS and the ADO, as I suggested before. Some children might be seen in CAMS as well. So typically a child will be seen in CAMS if there is evidence of an additional mental health need, or a child might be within CAMS being seen for a mental health need, and then it's felt that their needs might be better explained by autism or autism along with mental health needs, and then they might be seen within the CAMS service as well. It's important to reiterate there that autism in itself is not a mental health diagnosis. That's why there is a separate service to do that rather than all assessments going through CAMS. There are additional parts of an assessment that might be completed for certain children. So cognitive assessments might be completed. So a cognitive assessment might determine if the child's needs might be better explained by learning difficulty, or if the child might have a learning difficulty alongside their diagnosis as well. Okay. Other tools that you may have heard of are screening tools such as the MCHAT. So again, that stands for the Modified Checklist of Autism in Toddlers. These things won't give a diagnosis, but they can let you know if an assessment might be warranted. The autism quotient is another one for older children, which again is like almost like a questionnaire to see if the individual is showing autism symptoms, but they are autism characteristics, but they are screeners rather than shouldn't be used in place of a diagnosis. The 3DI is another assessment tool, which is the developmental, dimensional and diagnostic interview. So again, another type of interview that can be used. Okay, so moving on, I want to talk a little bit about how you might prepare for that assessment. So, as I said, the ADI is a long interview and it gets you to think about what your child's early development might be like. So that might be not so hard if your child is 5, but if your child is 15, that can be a struggle. My children aren't even 2 yet, and I can't really remember what they were like a year ago. So it can be quite difficult to kind of cast your mind back. But again, I'd reiterate what I said before, don't worry, clinicians are experienced in supporting you to get the information that they need. If you want to prepare yourself, it's useful to cast your mind back, try and think what your child might have been on those early years. Put your red books there. If sometimes they can be useful, thinking about when your child's first words were, when their first steps were, etc. And again, kind of talking to family members as well, grandparents, aunts, uncles, thinking about what they can remember about your young person's early developmental history might jog your memory to kind of think of some specific examples that might be useful when you're in that diagnostic interview. In terms of preparing your young child, preparing your your child or your young person for that assessment, getting as much information about the assessment as possible is helpful. So we know that young people with autism really struggle with anything that is outside of their typical routine or experience. There is kind of a core need in autism called social imagination. And it's just that, it's being able to predict or imagine anything that they haven't happened before. So actually, if you think about this assessment context, it is a bit out of the ordinary. So it might be quite challenging and anxiety provoking for that child. So once you have dates, when you know that that assessment is going to happen, it can be helpful to get as much information from that about the clinicians involved, so that you can prepare your child. Who will they be seeing? How long will they be seeing them for? Where will they be seeing them? So that you can relieve any anxieties that they might have. The other thing to remember about that ADOS that we talked about, or that child in the clinical setting, is that, I'm just saying it again, these clinicians are really experienced in doing these assessments and in trying to put your children at ease. Nobody wants to put a child through distress. That's not what they're aiming to do through this assessment. For two reasons. No one wants to put a child through distress. And secondly, you don't want anxiety to be masking what, to be affecting the assessment and what that child might be happening. I can remember my experience when I was involved in kind of doing assessments on a weekly basis. I felt like I got a lot better at interacting with children with autism than with neurotypical children. It's just, it becomes part of the clinician's way of interacting, helps put the child at ease and support them within that assessment context. And then finally motivate them. If they are doing something out of the ordinary, let them know that there's going to be something nice, and there's going to be something nice for them afterwards, a nice activity or a particular treat that they like. I think we'll talk a little bit more about how you might share information about a diagnosis with a young person later towards the end of my presentation. But how you kind of explain the assessment process to the child, again, will vary very much upon your personal circumstances. It may be that you've reached this point of assessment because your child or young person feels that they're different and they are fully aware of what autism is when they go ahead into the assessment. Or it may be that they're not, they're younger, they might not understand those concepts, you might not have wished to share them with them at that point in time. And in doing so, I think you can support the child by letting them know that they are going to meet these people who are going to play some games with them, going to have a chat with them, to help them think about how they can help them with some of the things that they may find difficult. And again, that can open a conversation with your child about the things that they might find difficult and the things that they might be good at, which can then sort of par the journey to talking to them about their diagnosis at a future date. I think the final thing I've got about preparing for the assessment is patience. I'm aware that it can be a very long journey. There are long waiting lists, and even getting to the point of assessment can be really long and anxiety provoking and challenging time for families. So in terms of trying to help you in thinking about how you can tolerate that wait, I think the one key message that I can give to you is that nothing significant is going to change once you get that diagnosis. Your child will still be exactly the same the day after the diagnosis as they were the day before. It's really important to remember that there's no medication, there's no cure once you receive that diagnosis. And I think the really important piece of information is that the vast majority of services out there are available whether you have that diagnosis or not. There are exceptions, but on the whole, you should be able to access these services even if you don't have a diagnosis. In particular, as an educational psychologist, I want to kind of reassure you that support at school is not dependent upon a diagnosis. And I can feel frustration with parents because I know that's not always the message you're given, and that may even not be the message that you're given from your child's school, but that is fundamentally not true. The SEN Code of Practice that is there for schools is a needs-led process. So an education, health and care plan, you do not need a diagnosis in order to get an education, health and care plan. It is a needs-led process. If your child is showing social difficulties in school, if your child is having communication difficulties in school, they should be receiving interventions to support those, and they may well benefit from autism-specific interventions to support those needs, regardless of whether they have a diagnosis or not. So it's really important to remember that when you might be going through this challenging and anxious wait for a diagnosis. And again, I think that comes down to the outcomes as well. So as an outcome of assessment, it may be that your child doesn't receive a diagnosis. And again, I think this is hard. I remember my experience when I was involved in the diagnostic process. And one thing that I really struggled with was that I used to dread meeting the parents when I wasn't giving the child a diagnosis. And that felt really counterintuitive to me, because I'm meeting parents and I'm telling them, oh, your child doesn't have a lifelong disability, yet that was harder than telling them that they did. And when I reflect upon that, it makes perfect sense. You have not gone through this exhausting process if there isn't a need there. So to be told that it isn't autism at the end of it, I understand that that can be really challenging for families, because there's the what next question. And again, obviously it depends upon circumstances. I'd reiterate the message that I just gave. You haven't gone through the assessment because your child isn't showing needs. It may just be that those needs are not significant to reach the criteria at this point in time. And that doesn't mean that they wouldn't benefit from strategies that might support a child with autism, even if they don't reach that diagnosis. So even if they don't get that diagnosis, it doesn't mean that they can't access that support. Again, they might not be getting that diagnosis because there's a differential diagnosis, or there is a different explanation for their needs. And actually that's really important, because if there is a different explanation for their needs, the strategies to support those needs might be slightly different to the things that we might use for children with autism. So a common differential diagnosis would be a learning difficulty. So it might, and again, sometimes not necessarily differential diagnosis, or a differential diagnosis might be an attachment disorder, or it might be that it's felt by that the child's needs are better explained by early significant trauma. And again, although the needs might present the same, the strategies to support those needs might be slightly different. Again, your child might get an autism if it's a no diagnosis. There might be signposting, or there might be a differential diagnosis. Even if your child does get a diagnosis, they may get a differential diagnosis, or it may be, or they, as part of the assessment, if other needs came up. So I know they often screen for ADHD within an assessment. There may actually be further assessment that child receives to get a differential diagnosis, or what we call a comorbid diagnosis, so something that goes along with that diagnosis. Lucy, you're the only face I can see, so just thumbs up if I'm still making sense. Okay, good, thank you, Lucy. Okay. Once you receive the diagnosis, you get a lovely long report which will outline your child's needs as presented in the criteria that we talked about before. And often those reports have lots of lovely strategies and recommendations for school as well. So I'd encourage you, once you get that report, to be sharing that with schools or early year settings, because it often does use recommendations that are useful to support in other settings as well. Okay. So,
what sort of time frame would parents expect to receive a report after an assessment?
I'm afraid I really can't answer that question,
Okay.
Lucy. I think, again, not being involved in the process myself, I think it would really vary upon the route to diagnosis that child has had. So certainly if it's a child that's been seen within the community paediatrics team, the report needs to be written and then endorsed by the autism panel. So there'll be a little wait in terms of that happening. But again, for other reports, again, sorry, I really don't know that. I really can't answer.
That's fine, thank you.
The next thing I wanted to talk about was the type of responses, emotional responses that as a parent you might experience in response to a diagnosis. So I kind of talked a little bit about my experience in delivering diagnosis and saying how hard I found it when I was telling parents that they didn't have a diagnosis. And I remember kind of talking to my supervisor at the time and them saying, well, when you talk to parents and you give them diagnosis, often the initial feeling is of relief, you know, and again, I certainly felt that when I was sharing that with parents, that you feel the relief when you receive that diagnosis. But then my supervisor told me that that relief can be short-lived as the enormity of the diagnosis, as they come to terms with the enormity of that diagnosis. And actually, there's been a lot of research in this area, and there are a number of different emotional experiences that that parents experience when their child receives a diagnosis of autism. And that's not to say that you'll experience these, all of these or some of these. And again, I think it's very dependent upon personal circumstances and situations about the diagnosis process, about the diagnostic process. But some of the things that have been detailed in research are things like shock, sadness, stress, grief, denial, guilt, anger and worry. Again, some studies have talked about worry about stigma and then shame and isolation around the diagnosis as well. And I think some of these more negative emotions are kind of understandable when you think about it. You know, I can understand that the feeling of fear and worry for your child, that what their future might look like. You know, they're experiencing difficulties, and knowing that these experiences are going to be lifelong can create a lot of anxiety about what life might be like for your child. Shock and denial are natural responses to fear of the unknown. If we're worried about what the future might be like, it's understandable that we might experience shock and denial as well. If we experience information that we find difficult to handle, we often deny that information in order to protect ourselves. So that's where denial can come when we're experiencing these large emotions. I think as well, when we're talking about some of these emotional responses, it's important to think about how the different responses that we might be experiencing within our family. So you and your partner might experience different feelings around a diagnosis, and that can be difficult to manage as well. Or there might be different experiences in your family unit. The emotions that you experience having gone through this diagnostic process quite closely might be very different to the experiences that your parents or the child's grandparents might be feeling. So really being open and communicating about these difficult emotions that we may be experiencing, I think, is really important to support the family as a whole, because the more united we are as a family, the more you can support your children as well. Grief is an understandable emotion around a diagnosis. There's a grief at the loss of the child that you thought you might have, or the experience that you thought they might have in their life. And I think it's really important to remember that that's not saying that there's anything wrong about your child. We love them, we love their differences, and it's amazing, but it's still okay to grieve the fact that you thought things might have been different. So I just want to encourage you not to feel guilty if you feel some of these large emotions and some of these negative emotions around diagnosis. It doesn't mean you love your child any less. If anything, it means you love them more. This is just a natural response to receiving a quite significant piece of news. Anger, again, is another experience, is another emotion that we might feel. I think it's okay to feel anger. As I said, anger is is a typical response to a grieving process. And you may well have felt anger all the way through the process. How long it takes, I find it quite difficult to talk about emotions at the end of a diagnosis, because I think it doesn't really reflect parents' experience, because you may have been experiencing these emotions all along the way. It's not that you suddenly experience these emotions when you get the diagnosis. These emotions are something that you have as you have been going through the diagnostic process and coming to terms with the fact that your child may be having this diagnosis even before they receive that diagnosis. But anger can be helpful. Anger can be a positive emotion, because anger often drives us towards action. And action is really important as a parent, because we're advocates for our children. So, and, you know, and it's important that we do everything to ensure that our child gets the support that they need. So how can we cope with some of these big emotions and feelings? So I've got some tips here. There's some links at the bottom of this slide about some articles that have been written about therapists and child psychologists about how you can manage some of these large feelings and emotions and responses that you might have to diagnosis. I think the first one is just reiterating that you need to give yourself space to have those emotions. You might surprise yourself. As I said, you may have experienced a long wait for this diagnosis. You may have spent a long time coming to terms with a diagnosis before your child even has it, and you may think, well, I'm not going to feel different when I have that diagnosis. But actually, it can be quite a turning point, and you might surprise yourself with the emotions that you feel. Having said that, there's no right or wrong way to feel. You may feel all of the emotions described, you may feel absolutely none of them. All of it is going to depend upon your personal circumstances. And whatever the responses that you have, just it's okay. Give yourself time and allow yourself space to feel those emotions. As well as allowing yourself time to give those emotions, just reiterating that it's okay to grieve. You don't have to feel guilty. We'll talk about neurodiversity a little bit and how autism, I felt uncomfortable talking through the diagnostic criteria because it is worded so negatively, and that is not my experience of children and young people with autism. They are absolutely fantastic. So I love the concept of neurodiversity. So I can understand. So I feel it hard to say that you might grieve having a child who's neurodiverse because they're absolutely fantastic, but at the same time, it is okay to grieve because that might not be what you were expecting. And as a parent, the biggest worry for a child is that they may experience difficulties in their life, and I think it's okay to kind of grieve that fact. And the third tip is about doing research. Again, I think this is a funny tip because I don't think you get to the point of pursuing a diagnosis without having done your research about autism. And I mean, you all probably know lots more than me, but you do your research. But again, I think after the diagnosis is another good time, and I think doing research is important because it makes us feel in control. Doing research is something that positive that you can do, and at a time when we are feeling overwhelmed by emotions, it can be helpful to have a focus. So actually a lot of people report that doing their research, finding about autism, and again, really finding out what autism means for their particular child can be really helpful in that post-diagnostic period to support you to take back that control and manage some of the difficult emotions that you might be experiencing. The last one, which I think is nice, is about dreaming new dreams. And again, that's about really learning to understand and accept our children for who they really are, seeing them in this new light within the diagnosis. And again, I'd encourage you to think within the neurodiversity sphere rather within that deficit sphere, thinking about all the wonderful strengths that this diagnosis brings and beginning to think, well, what the future might be like, and thinking to dream dreams and what your hopes and aspirations will be for your child in the context of that diagnosis rather than regardless of that diagnosis. And having those, by having new dreams, we within the context, by thinking of our dreams within the context of that diagnosis, they're more likely to be based more on reality and therefore more likely to be attainable as well. So yeah, I can encourage you to kind of read those articles because they can be helpful if you are struggling with some of the difficult emotions and experiences around autism. Okay, so
I love that, thinking of new dreams and things there. And the
yeah,
emotions is something we talk about a lot in like the support groups, and just meeting other parents that understand how you're feeling can be really beneficial as well. So
yeah.
I love that. New dreams is really
And
nice.
that's really nice. You just kind of said about meeting with new parents as well. I'm going to I'll skip ahead to a point that I was going to make on this side about the individual's response to diagnosis. So we've talked about the parental responses to diagnosis. So now we're thinking about what the child and the young person's response to diagnosis might be. There's not a huge amount of research in this area, a lot, for children specifically. A lot of the research is about how adults respond to their diagnosis. And what you were just saying, Lucy, there is about how important and how helpful you found it to kind of meet with other parents and kind of talk about it. And actually, the more we understand about autism, the more we realise how important that is for the child and the individual with autism themselves as well. You can often, if you have autism, you can live your life feeling very other, very different. And that's really hard because belonging is a fundamental human right. So to feel like you don't belong can be really damaging and really significantly impact your self-esteem. So actually what we see in individuals with autism is often lowered senses of self-esteem. And that can be linked to the fact that, or around that feeling of not belonging. So actually what we find in terms of responses to diagnosis is actually that can increase self-esteem by increasing the individual's belonging, by thinking, oh, well, okay, maybe I'm not the same as all those people, but I've got a lot of similarities with these people. And actually that label can give you a sense of belonging and a peer group that you can, a peer group to help you understand yourself. So kind of, Lucy, just as you're saying, working with other parents to kind of get that belonging around families of individuals with autism, that's what we find in individuals and children with young people themselves. It can be really positive around diagnosis in terms of boosting their sense of belonging by giving them a group of people to belong to. And interestingly, kind of the research about how individuals respond to autism suggests that most individuals construe it as a positive event in their life. So I've got a little statistic there, which I think was from an online survey from, I can't remember what it was called. It's something like, I'm autistic, not weird, which is an online survey. So they did an online survey about for individuals with autism. And it was massive. There was about 7,491 responses. And of those responses, a whopping 89% of them said that learning about their autism had a positive impact overall. It was only 4% who who disagreed or strongly disagreed with that comment. So again, kind of showing how the diagnosis can be a positive event for individuals with autism. I've got some things here as well from Tony Atwood, who's an expert in autism, and he talks about adults' responses from his clinical experience, saying that many found it a positive event in their life and wished that the diagnosis had been made and explained in their early childhood, and actually felt anger that their needs hadn't been recognised sooner, because it meant that they either felt like they didn't belong for such a long period of time, and that they had to, and they experienced grief from grieving the childhood that they lost from trying to fit in and being normal. So again, Lucy, coming back to that masking that you kind of mentioned as well, how exhausting it has been for their lives, masking, trying to pretend that they're normal when that's not normal when that's not the way that they feel. Relief, again, just as we found, one of the most significant emotions in parents is relief. The same for individuals with autism, relief at knowing that that it's not their fault. And again, construing the diagnosis as positive because it helps them to achieve a better understanding of themselves. Again, just coming back to the belonging point, so the Autistic Not Weird survey, it asked about masking, and in response to the statement, I feel the need to mask in groups of non-autistic people, 85 respondents strongly agreed to that, compared to 20% when it said I feel the need to mask in a group of autistic people. So again, that real importance of belonging, you know, being exhausting, needing to mask all the time, but actually finding a sense of belonging around other autistic peers who may have a greater sense of understanding for the kind of needs that they experience. I'm going to click on a link here because you've listened to me talking about experience, but I think it's a lot more powerful to hear about the experiences of young people. And I don't think it's going to work. So what I'm going to do, I thought that might happen. What I will do is I'll get to the end of the presentation, and when I finish the presentation, I'll bring up the link and share my screen for that link. Might that work, Lucy? Yeah, and then we can use that as well. However, I would encourage, I put it here, it's the Ambitious About Autism website. And this page is specifically about children and young people talking about their experience of the diagnosis. And again, it has a lot of resources for children and young people who may have received that diagnosis. And it's a fab resource to use for children if when you're at that stage. Okay, so telling your child. So again, it's really difficult how and when to tell your child. It's really going to vary. It's very much up to you as parents, and will depend upon their age, their needs, and wishes. You know your children best, and you know what the best course of action may be around this. There are many experts who suggest that a really good time to tell your child is when the child starts to notice and feel that they are different from their peers. As we just talked about before, this feeling of difference can often lead to more masking, which can be exhausting. So actually, if your child is starting to express or show that they're beginning to feel different, this can be a good time to start introducing ideas around autism and paving the way to talking to them about their diagnosis, because once they're saying that they feel different, understanding that, receiving that diagnosis, hearing that diagnosis is likely to be a positive step in their understanding of themselves. I think it's the National Autistic Society, but it gives this kind of nice strategy about how to share in terms of the strengths and weakness activity, where you talk with your child about maybe different family members, talk about the things that they're good at, the things that they find difficult, move that on to talk about the child themselves, the things that they are good at and things that they find difficult, and then sharing with them that there is a pattern of needs there and that there is a name for these needs, and kind of introducing that diagnosis there can kind of be a helpful and supportive way to explain the differences to that child. Again, I said it before, but this concept of neurodiversity, I think, is really important when we're sharing the diagnosis with children. So neurodiversity asserts that autism is just one type of neurological development. It's normal human difference, and it should be recognised and respected just as any other human variation. The little clip that I really hope I'm going to have time to show you, I think his name's Patrick, the young man, kind of tells us about how helpful he found it to read biographies and learn about famous people that were autistic and understand their experience and establish those positive role models. So I've got a couple of those positive role models up there as well. And again, really help think about this idea of neurodiversity, because having gone through the diagnostic experience, which can be very deficit-led, it's really nice to kind of reframe that and think about the strengths to ensure that the child or young person has a positive association with autism, and therefore a positive sense of self, positive sense of identity. Again, it was this idea of neurodiversity, I think it was back in 2013 now, so it was based upon slightly different diagnostic criteria. But Tony Atwood, who I mentioned before, and Carol Gray, who's another expert in the area of autism, came up with what they called the discovery criteria. So this was almost like an alternative to the diagnostic criteria, because the diagnostic criteria has all this kind of negative wording. So what they did is they kind of flipped that wording on its head to kind of talk about the key differences that we have in autism rather than the key deficits or key difficulties, to try and help create this kind of more positive sense of neurodiversity and what autism can be. I'll just read, it's long, I've put some of the key points on here, but I'll just kind of read the first, I'll go through kind of the first area of the criteria just to kind of give you a sense of what they mean. So they talked about autism as being a qualitative advantage rather than disadvantage in social interaction, as manifested by a majority of the following: peer relationships characterized by absolute loyalty and impeccable dependability, free of sexist, ageist or culturalist biases, ability to regard others at face value, speaking one's mind irrespective of social context or adherence to personal beliefs, seeking an audience or friends capable of enthusiasm for unique interests or topics, consideration of details, spending time discussing a topic that may not be of primary interest, interested primarily in significant contributions to conversation, preferring to avoid ritualistic small talk or socially trivial statements and superficial conversations. It's really lovely. It kind of flips that deficit language on its head, and again kind of gives a really more positive sense of what autism can be. It goes through for the whole of the diagnostic criteria as it was before it got revised, but again it's a lovely thing to read, and again you can again it's easily found online if you kind of just Google discovery criteria Atwood and Gray. Again, the other kind of tips for understanding autism and sharing diagnosis, again, the young man, he's not a little tall, the young man, the autistic young man, the clip that I'm hopefully show you at the end of the talk, he talks about how helpful it was to read books. So I've just given some recommendations at the end about some books that can be supportive and helpful in explaining the diagnosis to young people. The first book I've got there is my autism book. And again, this is kind of designed for children aged 5 to 9. And it's based as kind of a simple introduction to diagnosis. It's written by a doctor and a children's author. And it's designed to be read with your child to kind of talk about the needs of experiences of autism, but also think about how those needs relate to them. That's a really important point when we're talking about diagnosis in autism. It's really important for us to remember and encourage young people that autism is difficult for everybody, particularly if we're encouraging them to think about other people with autism, because just because you're autistic doesn't mean you have the same experience as somebody else. You really have to think, just because you meet this set of defined criteria doesn't mean your experience is going to be exactly the same as somebody else's. It's really important to encourage the young person to understand what their diagnosis means for them, to help them understand it better. And that's really important in terms of ensuring that a diagnosis is a positive thing rather than becoming a way that a child, you don't want a child just to be seen in terms of their label, their diagnosis. You want to be able to, for them to be seen as an individual. So it's important for them to understand what that diagnosis means for them. And then this book, my autism book, The Child's Guide to Autistic Spectrum, it ends with a summary checklist, and it helps the child record how they think their autism affects them. So it's kind of not just a book, but a nice tool to use with your child to explain the diagnosis to them. All My Stripes is about a little zebra, and Hello Raw Little Dinosaur is about a little dinosaur. It's actually a set of books, Hello Raw Little Dinosaur, and they are written specifically for young children with autism to help them better understand their diagnosis. Different Like Me is a lovely one. That's for slightly older children, I'd say about 8 to 12. And again, that kind of goes through people in history. So it's talking about positive role models with autism to help the young person understand autism a bit better. And then the Asper Kids Secret Book of Social Rules, again, is more for sort of tweens and teenagers, and helping them. And again, I think it's written by an autistic author, helping them understand some of the crazy social rules that neurotypical people have. Again, it can be useful, I think, to read people's experiences. So actually some of the most useful text or books are ones that come from the individual's experience. So a lovely book is The Reason I Jump, which is actually written by a non-verbal author, and is really powerful in kind of getting across the perspective of a person with autism, particularly around sensory needs. So I'd encourage that one to read. And the way I see it is, again, a sort of handbook or a memoir written by Temple Grandin, who again is she's a Nobel Prize winner with autism and a very famous autism advocate. Their books. We live in the digital age. There are lots of resources that you can find online as well, including a TED Talk by Temple Grandin, which is quite helpful. And again, for children and young people, the Ambitious About Autism website is useful as well. So I've included those ones. The final one is a book again, as I put that kind of about helping siblings understand as well, because I think another important thing to think about post-diagnostic is not just how the diagnosis is explained to the young person, but also how it can be explained to siblings as well. So that's quite a nice text as well to support with that. So I think that's it. I think I've got through everything I wanted to say today. I will come out of my presentation quickly and try and share with you, try and find a way to share with you the young person's perspective, because I think that's really helpful. And then again, I've just left there with a lovely quote by Temple Grandin about neurodiversity, about how, you know, autism is something really important. We need to move away from the deficit language around it, because if we didn't have people with autism, probably never get anything done, would we? So I am going to leave. Oh no, I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stop sharing and try and find a way to share a different screen with you. Just bear with me 2 minutes. Any questions while we're there, Lucy? So you can just prompt me.
Yeah, no, that's been absolutely brilliant. And I think you've answered a lot of the questions that have sort of come up sort of as you've gone through the talk. So yeah, I think one of the biggest concerns parents have is, like I said earlier, is about the masking, either through an observation or through the questionnaires that get sent to schools and various places. I know that's a big concern for a lot of parents.
I think one other thing about the questionnaires that are sent to schools, and again, this is something we experience from parents a lot, and it's really difficult, the masking situation, where you have a child who in school, oh, we've got no concerns about them in school, but that effort of masking is so draining that the child that you see at home is kind of really different. You know, you're not experiencing the same child, you're experiencing a child who's exhausted, and their behaviour showing that. I think the only thing I would encourage parents around that is the importance of communicating with schools. Schools hopefully are becoming more aware around autism, and the better relationship you can have with schools to kind of understand that, the more you can help them see maybe those subtle signs that the child isn't experiencing at school as well as you think they are. So I think it's far better to kind of have those continued open dialogues and conversations with school prior to those social communication questionnaires coming out, so that when they do, the school is kind of is prepared and more likely to be supportive in thinking of those subtle signs and being honest if they don't see those needs. But again, you kind of sharing that with the clinicians that are doing the diagnosis as well, because clinicians are aware of that experience too. Okay.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so let's try and share my screen. Yes, I can do it. You see that okay, Lucy? Is that
Okay, we haven't got
I'm
that
Patrick.
as audio.
I was diagnosed at age 10. I'm currently 21. I felt when I got my autism diagnosis, it answered a lot of questions, mainly about how I think. Having a diagnosis helped me set expectations for myself that were realistic for the way I live and learn, made me kinder to myself, and allowed me to know that it was okay if I couldn't do something. It explained to them why I always felt different from other people and why I didn't always just click with other people in friendship groups and things. For everybody else, it was really easy and everybody else had friends, and I really didn't. I may have had 1 or 2 friends, and it was quite a lonely time. So how I understood what autism was is that I used to read a lot of books about it. My mum bought me quite a large amount of books on autism, mainly ones about famous people with autism. And then the internet came along, and then I could research myself. So mainly one of the first places I went was the National Autistic Society's website. I can have a look on there. And then social media came along, and this opened up the door to loads of different autistic people to share their experiences, and I found out quite a lot, and found a lot of relatable experiences. So if you've just been diagnosed, I would find some really reliable sources to read as much as you can about autism. Find articles that mean something to you, and definitely articles written by other autistic people can be honest and realistic about the issues that you could face. I think learning about yourself is a very healthy thing to do. I mostly learned about myself by looking at other people and not making comparisons, and probably how I differ from other people, such as a lot of people can feel comfortable in a room full of music and loud music and flashing lights, and I really can't. I felt most confident about being autistic when I was way older. I was about 19 when I just started volunteering at the school that I went to. I decided to be a lot more open with my diagnosis to people I felt safe with. And I began conversations sometimes about autism and how it affects my life, but equally that a lot of other people where I was were going through similar experiences. So it helped me relate to them.
Okay, yeah, I just thought helpful to end on the experience of a young person with autism, but again reiterating how helpful he found it to read more about his diagnosis and meet with other people who had similar diagnosis as well.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time this morning and for doing that presentation. It's been really, really helpful. So thank you very much for that.
Great.